The Neoliberal Podcast is part of the Neoliberal Project and made possible by our members and supporters. If you enjoy the podcast and want to become a member of the project, head to neoliberalproject.org/join. You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/neoliberalproject. These members and patrons help cover the podcast's expenses and make it all happen. Thanks for your support and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson. Joining me today is Maia Mindel. She's the chief neoliberal shill for 2021. She's an Argentinian economics blogger, and today's episode is talking about the economics of Argentina and her experiences on social media and using it as a communications tool for economics, and all of the things that she's been writing about on her blog, which is someunpleasant.substack.com. And I promise that it's not very unpleasant at all. So, Maia Mindel, welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here.
Glad to have you here. And I guess the first thing we should talk about is just I'm kind of curious what your origin story is. How did you get interested in economics and politics and writing about all this stuff? And what was the beginning of kind of your wanting to be involved in all of this?
Well, regarding economics, I used to be into physics when I was in second to last year of high school. But then I realized I'm hopeless at it. So I started reading books and surfing the web, so to speak, to try to find what actually interested me. And for a brief moment, it was actually psychology. But then over the summer, I read Why Nations Fail by Acemoglu and Robinson, and I was pretty interested in it. And then I was like, okay, I'm gonna give this whole economics thing a go, and read some other books, articles, tried to following the news, and then I was like, yeah, this sounds like something I could do, and here we are.
It's funny, the neoliberal Bible is what got you into economics. The holy text of Why Nations Fail.
I'm not a huge fan of the book, and I'm not a huge fan of Acemoglu, but I think it's a good book, and it's a really good summary of his research, at least.
So what got you involved in Econ Twitter specifically? Because there's a lot of people who are probably familiar with you from Econ Twitter, and that's how they've run into you posting about some of these things. And actually, though, there's something we should address really quickly, is that your account was banned. What was going on? It looked like the world was ending there for a second.
Yeah, they told me why, but they haven't told me yet. So as of right now, exactly what they think I did that broke the rules. They told me what rule I broke, but not what the offending tweet was. So I'm just gonna wait and see if I can get it overturned, because I'm pretty sure I didn't break any rules. Maybe I did, but didn't say anything egregious, I'd say.
Well, we do know you have a new account out there. It's just at Maia Mindel. We'll link that in the show notes if anybody wants to make sure to refollow your favorite chief neoliberal shill. But yeah, I guess I'm curious just how you got involved in this world of Econ Twitter, because it's a really interesting place, and I want to say more about it. But how did you first get involved in kind of posting about all this stuff online?
Well, it's really bizarre, because I started my interest in economics in the favorite book of the neoliberals, and I actually started posting about economics in the neoliberal subreddit in 2019, 2020. And then over the summer I was like, okay, I'm gonna go on Twitter, because I feel it might be a better place to learn from people who are more knowledgeable than me and interact with them, hopefully. I wouldn't have guessed I was going to be as successful as I have, right? On Twitter. And then it was like about 2-3 months later, I was like, well, I mean, I have some interesting things to say, and I think that Twitter is like a really bad place to write at length, because like if you're doing a thread, then like it's very clunky and you have to like plan it out so it fits, your ideas fit, because like having half a sentence and then half a sentence is really uncomfortable to read. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna start a blog, and I'm gonna like try and write about things. And a lot of these things were originally things like that about like Argentina and Latin America and stuff that had sources primarily in Spanish, because I was like, well, I mean, nobody else on mainstream econ Twitter and the econ blogosphere is writing about like female labor participation in Latin America, which was like my first blog post. And then, well, I sort of like, I didn't expect it to be successful. I mean, it's somewhat successful. I get like 1,000 readers, which is a good number. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna keep doing it because it seems to have caught on. And well, a year and a half ish later, I'm still here.
Yeah, I mean, look, more than 1,000 readers at a time is no small thing, and it's just such a fascinating part of the internet that if you have enough ideas, or if you're creative enough, you can kind of just jump into this conversation with like very respected people, because on the one hand, for a long time you were just a Twitter account with a picture of a shark.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you were having these conversations with like really well-respected economists at like Ivy League universities, and they're going back and forth with you, and they're just, you guys are exchanging ideas. And like, that's the beauty of Twitter and the beauty of social media, is anybody can kind of make that jump to some extent.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and that's what really interested me on Twitter as a platform, that like you can talk with anyone, and you can see what anyone is thinking, and you can just ask them if you have a question, because it's very democratic. Of course, like it has its drawbacks, which is that if you're well known enough, you start getting like the craziest people imaginable in your mentions. But I mean, I haven't had that problem as much. Depends on like whether or not like it's a big enough post, and if it's a controversial enough topic.
I have a thing that I say about Twitter sometimes, which is that it's just a very different experience depending on how many followers you have. And this is not like flexing, like, oh, I've got a bunch of followers, but it's more like if you have 500 followers, it's kind of like you're having a small chat with your friends. If you have, 5,000 or 10,000, then I think that might be the sweet spot where you can have like in-depth conversations, but you're also maybe big enough to get noticed sometimes. But then if you have like 50,000, you're going to have an army of trolls who just kind of hate you. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. Like you will have people who hate you.
Statistically, it's like inevitable that if you are known, but like I don't know, if you have 50,000 followers, you're known by at least 100,000 people, and at that point, it's statistically inevitable that there's like a small clique that absolutely hates you and like will try to annoy you as much as possible.
And when you're up at like, I don't know, like 500,000 followers, that's essentially just like being on television. Like you can't even respond to people anymore because every post is going to get 100 responses that, or something like that. So you're essentially just giving a public speech at that point.
Yeah, you're basically a celebrity going on like Jimmy Kimmel or whatever.
Beyond the social media stuff, and I think we'll come back to that over and over because social media was so much of a part of, you being elected chief neoliberal shill and starting this blog.
Yeah, of course.
But beyond that, you are also a person who has a lot of ideas about economics and specifically about, like you said, Latin American countries, the Latin American economy, and specifically about your home country, Argentina. So I guess just to give people some basic information, most of our listeners are not from Argentina. They might be from America or Europe or Canada or somewhere else in the world. But what should non-Argentinians know about Argentina's economy? How would you explain the history of what Argentina's kind of been going through?
We're going to be here for a really long time. Basically, I mean, right now and for the last 70 years, except like one decade, the big problem has been inflation. Basically, it's always been how to deal with that. So, like, what should the government do about prices? What kind of policy should they adopt? And that's what's led the discussion of economics except for since like the 40s, except during the 90s. And like before that, well, like you have to jump back like before World War One, because the between wars period was a mess everywhere. You had like really complicated politics and really complicated economic phenomena. So you had the Great Depression and World War II and everything. So before World War One, you had basically like the economy was fairly successful, especially like in the 1880s. So it took in a lot of investment, lot of immigration, very fast growing. There's been some discussion at length about like income inequality and that kind of thing, and I haven't like read anything very definitive about it. So it could be. So it said like it was about as high as most are, as in like developed countries, and this was what was known as the Gilded Age. So in the US, so it's not a very equal period, but not like astonishingly unequal, I'd say. And well, and it was characterized by like a very open economy.
Well, and this is one of the most interesting things about Argentina, is that there was a time, probably about 100 years ago, or maybe a little bit more, when Argentina was one of the wealthiest countries in the world.
Well, I mean, the research is a bit over the place on that one, because like during that time it's really, really hard to estimate like GDP and in constant prices, and especially like to estimate the informal economy. So you might be like overstating how rich the country was, but like you see that like GDP per capita goes down in Uruguay and Chile too, but it goes down like a lot more persistent in Argentina. So like you might not say it was one of the richest countries in the world, but it was a fairly successful, prosperous country, and then like it started going downhill sometime in the like 1930 to 1950. It's like when the period when you could agree, when most people would agree, like things started going downhill.
Would you say that there's a specific reason that things started going downhill? What's the story behind why Argentina's economy went from fairly prosperous, fairly successful, to what we know it as today, which is kind of like, not to be unkind, but people make a lot of jokes about Argentina, you know, and you make jokes about Argentina. So how did we get here?
It's
like
not a rich
what was
country anymore.
What was the first thing that happened, would you say? The first important thing that happened to kind of start that movement?
I'd say that like you can actually say that there was a big sudden turning point, because there was, and it's basically 1930 when there was like the first successful coup. And it's pretty funny because like I listened to another podcast where it's like two historians talking about this, and they say that it was doomed to fail. The government knew that like everyone was planning the coup, and they knew like what they wanted to do and everything, and they had like a couple hundred recruits from military school, from military academy. So it was kind of like a miracle that they succeeded in like arresting the president and taking over the country. And then like what happened there was first it was a big shift in economic policies. This happened like worldwide, and it happened across all of Latin America, which was like a big shift away from like like an open economy with like a small government, and in some ways it was like a good thing because obviously you do need like a government that does some things, and the government wasn't doing a lot. But also there was like a big shift towards like economic nationalism and like kind of trying to plan the credit market particularly, and try to like use trade as like a tool to develop the country. And even if you're agnostic about like if either of those things can work, it's pretty clear that they didn't work. So, and like you combine, well, basically a very powerful government, and there was like a really big effort to like try to set up the economy into like these sort of, I'd say, like trade groups. So you had like obviously all of the trade unions, and they were set up so there was like only one union per occupation, and they all were in like the same workers central, which like represents all the unions. And they did the same with like a bunch of types of businesses, and which like I mean, they're not really farmers, they're more like landowners, but like with the farmers, I'll call them. And then like, so the government only has to negotiate with like a handful of people, so like with the industrial union, and with like the small business owners, and with the farmers, and with the workers. And so they set up the economy. But like you combine a really powerful government that like, where like monetary policy is really, really dependent on whoever's president at the time, because like since the central bank was created in 1935, and since then only one president completed his term, and it was the first one. So you had like really non-independent monetary policy, and you had like a really powerful central bank that basically controlled all of the country's lending. And you had a lot of pressure groups that were really powerful, because like you like piss off the farmers, and suddenly like they stop selling meat for a month. And
so you're saying that at this point the central bank was actually very, very powerful during this age.
I mean, it had a lot of like powers that we normally don't see in modern central banks. So it had a lot of authority. This was more in the 40s though. A lot of authority over lending, a lot of authority over like international trade.
I guess my question is, was it powerful but independent, or powerful but also kind of dependent on whoever the president was, and it was subject to politics?
I mean, like, it was subject to politics. And, well, they obviously designed, like, the central bank's policies, so it will have, like, a very political role. But it was very clear that, like, monetary policy was conducted primarily to further political objectives, and not, like, to stabilize the value of the currency. I mean, there was, like, a handful of times where they actually attempted that, but because of the political instability, like, if your plan wasn't successful nearly immediately, you had, like, no real chance of like, preserving an independent central bank, because suddenly I think that, like, the reasons why the country went downhill are primarily institutional. So, like, you had a really...
And you said you didn't enjoy Asimolu. Come on.
Yeah, but, like, you had, like, a really economically powerful government, and you had a really really powerful pressure groups that, like, want money for their for the people they represent. So, like, the farmers want a higher exchange rate and better trade terms, and the workers want higher wages, and the businesses want higher profits, and the industrial union wants, like, a lower exchange rate so they can buy imported parts for cheap. And you had this, and you had a very economically powerful government, and you had a lot of political instability. And because of later political developments, like, basically whoever won the presidential election controlled the entirety of the government, because, like, when they let so there's this thing called Peronism, which is like,
yeah, it's funny, I was about to ask you about that. My next question was going to be, we're talking about this early Argentinian kind of early democracy, and if there's one name that most people outside of Argentina know, it's Perón. So how does he play into this whole story? Is he the president during the times when all this is happening, or like what's his role in all of this drama?
Well, basically, he was he was a military officer from the 1930s onwards. He was like he played a role in one of the coups, which was like a really weird, like not the first one, the second one which was in 1943, but like the country wasn't a real democracy back then. Back then, anyway, so they just like completed the transition to autocracy, and he became really really popular because of his labor policies as labor secretary and then vice president during the 40s. And then he was like imprisoned in 1946 because he was so popular that like the president feared he was like going to try to depose him. And basically like a lot of workers protested, and he was released, and the government kind of fell apart. And oh no, it was in 1945, and they said, well, we're having elections next year. And the US tried to intervene in those by promoting like like all of the other parties basically joined because they didn't like Perón, and they all joined into one alliance called like the Democratic Union. And well, they lost. They lost handily, but not like overwhelmingly. They got like a third to 40% of the vote. So
yeah, Perón was legitimately very popular during his
time.
Yeah,
he was really popular, and he had like really strong support in Congress too, because like like in the US we have like a presidential system with a Senate. Back then we had an electoral college, but like it's not like as skewed. I mean, the problem here is that like one province has like 40% of the population. Back then it was like 25%, but still. So that's the province of Buenos Aires, which is like right next to a city, and the city was a part of it back then. It's a whole thing, but basically like he had a lot of political support, and he like changed a lot of the country's laws so that his party would be more successful. And he also like basically like the Peronist ideology is like kind of incoherent and kind of like changed a lot throughout time, but it's like the one constant is like economic nationalism basically. So like a closed economy, high taxes, high spending, a lot of like government planning and that sort of thing. So he had a first 5-year plan, which was like, we're going to give subsidized credits to all of these companies, to like basically the entire country, and we're gonna have like we're gonna have like a single government-owned entity like control all of the country's international trade. And that was like really distortionary. So like between the 1890s and the 1940s, the country's main export wasn't actually meat, and it hasn't been meat for like a really long time now either. It was actually like grains, because like they were easier to ship and lower cost and everything, but because like they had to face really high export taxes and like much worse prices than meat, and because the exchange rate was so low, like adjusted for inflation, like if you like it was really expensive to sell grains abroad. So they just like shifted over to meat, and that's how like the meat years and persisted until the 1990s.
That's why everyone knows about Argentinian beef is the best beef, and that's probably why we're familiar.
Yeah, right now, like the beef industry is sort of like not very successful. I think that in terms of value, we export about as much meat as we export gold, and it's like less than 10% of all exports. Still, it's still an important sector, but like we're a net importer of meat and that sort of thing. So it's not it's like a resource that's really underutilized because of government policy, basically.
So you talk about how the Peronism, I think you said it's not actually very coherent, but that the one distinguishing feature is kind of nationalism and just control. And it does seem that way to me. I'm an outsider, so I don't really know. But it always seems like whoever is president of Argentina at any given time just says, well, I'm just going to kind of fiddle with the economy, and I'm going to push this lever here, and I'm going to pull that lever, and almost like I know best, and therefore the economy will just do what I want it to do.
Absolutely. Like, I mean, everyone else was kind of like that. There were like very few economically liberal, let's say, options back then. And I mean, like, basically the whole thing was like, we're going to like spend a lot of money to increase demand and like increase investment in like some sectors. But then you had like a really like basically the exact same thing happened every decade, at least once, which was you had like a lot of stimulus to demand, especially like consumption and investment, and you had like a lot of discouragement of supply, especially of like in like farming. So you had export controls and export taxes and price controls and a really low exchange rate. And eventually, because of the specific industries they subsidized, which were like, they employed a lot of people, but they required a lot of imports too. So most infamously textiles, and then also like cars. Because of like these two phenomena and the overvalued exchange rate, you eventually had like the central bank ran out of reserves. And you needed like a really sharp devaluation of the currency, and that like increased inflation a lot, because I mean, at least in that time, you can actually argue this that like it raised the prices of a lot of products that participated in international trade, so like milk and beef and grains. But obviously there were a lot of controls still, so it was a really an issue of like people didn't really know like how expensive things were going to be, so they just like raised prices. And this happened about 3-4 times a decade in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the really funny part is that like this happened during halfway through Peron's first term. He wasn't going to lose because like he also did a lot of political reforms, some of which were good, like giving women the vote or like abolishing the electoral college. But like he also basically turned Congress into like a guaranteed majority for his party, and like not a guaranteed majority, but like a guaranteed almost unanimity for his party. Like the opposition wasn't like going to beat him 1-on-1, but they still got a third of the vote, 40% of the vote, that sort of number, and like he's just turning it into like 10% of Congress being non-Peronist. And like when that happened, he also reformed the constitution to allow like to basically enshrine all of his economic policies into law, and also to allow for like re-election of the president, because terms were just one term, 6 years long, but you would get like infinite ones if you just waited 6 years in between terms. And like but the economy started like this thing that I just described, that like you had a lot of issues with like international trade, and the economy started slowing because there weren't any imports. So you had really high imports and really low and like lower or non-growing or stagnant exports. And so basically how many reserves you had, which conditioned how much you could import, and conditioned the economic activity, depended on international prices.
And economic reserves, your reserves of another country's currency, which lets you buy things from that country, that also matters if you have debt. And this is another story that is kind of told about Argentina, is that Argentina is the country that defaults. And I looked up an article, and it's funny, I looked up several articles about this. I'm not sure that they actually can even agree on how many times Argentina has defaulted. One article said 9 times, another article said maybe 7 or 8. But I guess, what's the story there economically, as far as why Argentina had defaulted on its debt to begin with, and why does it keep defaulting on its debt?
Well, I mean, like, the thing about like there was a lot of like foreign debt before like the 30s and 40s, and a lot of it during the 70s. And I'll get to the 70s later because it was like an incredibly messy decade. And there was a lot of it in the 90s and early 2000s, and quite the number in like 2015 to 2019. But the issue here is that like basically the government didn't borrow any money during the like economically nationalist period. Let's say they just like printed the money from the central bank, and while interest rates were really low, and by really low I mean much lower than inflation. So that over time that really weakened the financial market. So you had to borrow all of your money abroad if you wanted to and if you could. So obviously once you started having issues with like international payments and such,
interest rates being lower than inflation is really interesting because it makes it seem like, if inflation is going to run at 20%, but the interest rate is only like 4%, then I could essentially just make money by taking out a loan and doing nothing and then paying it back with, like...
Yeah, that like, because of that, they just like...
Because the money you're paying back at the end in real terms is not worth as much, I guess.
Yeah, obviously, like, I mean, that's why they didn't lend to people. Like, the government kind of made banks lend money, especially after like in the 40s and 50s and 60s. So they just didn't lend to anyone who like they didn't have to, because obviously the banks were going to lose money on on their loans, and obviously people didn't save in banks because they were going to lose money. So that really distorted like the economy, and that probably lowered growth over the long term. Because if you like there's like a small argument, there's like a small theoretical point that maybe higher inflation could contribute to growing the economy, because it shifts people's savings like out of banks and into like investment. So you could have like people investing in like factories and that sort of thing. But the problem here is that if you look at like what people invested in, they didn't invest in factories, because if you had like high inflation, and high inflation is more volatile, so you have a 2% inflation, it goes up and down a little bit, and like if you have 50% inflation, it can go up and down like 5 points a year, so you can end up like losing a lot of money. So people didn't like really know how profitable investing in a factory would have been. And you also had like legal concerns, like, is there going to be like a massive recession this year, and are we going to like just lose all of our money? And sometimes people like wonder, like, is the government just like seizing our factory, or is the government like taxing all the profits away? So there was a lot of uncertainty there. So people just like bought US dollars in cash and like stored them in their house, or bought like real estate, which because you can't like take out a mortgage in like pesos if you're going to like, if half of the value is going to be gone in like a year. So
it's also hard to devalue real estate in the long run, because
and like if the government's going after like your house, then like things have done really really bad, so you won't like be bothering about like the investments if the government is just like seizing people's like homes. So it's just ended up being all like US dollars in cash and real estate. And so like some people have argued that having low real interest rates helped like the East Asian countries, so like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. And I mean, I can't really say because I'm not an expert, but it definitely didn't help Argentina, because it's just like shifted all of these savings away from banks and away from like any useful use, and then just into like housing and US dollars in cash. And later a lot of those went into like tourism, so people would go to Uruguay and buy like TVs in cash and bring them back to Argentina.
It's funny, I feel like some degree of that still happens in some countries. I don't know if it's a thing in Argentina.
Until like fairly recently, it was like a really big thing that like people would save money in US dollars and go on vacation to like Miami.
I know there are Brazilians who will come to the United States because Brazil has really, really harsh like tariffs and taxes on foreign electronics, like Xboxes and iPhones and MacBooks. They will come to the US and they will buy like a bunch of iPhones and MacBooks and PlayStations and bring them back to sell them at like a markup in Brazil. And it's almost like they can turn a profit just by taking a vacation.
Yeah, that's absolutely, that's like, I haven't heard of many people who do exactly that, but it's fairly common that if like a family member or a family friend is traveling, you like, they might offer that like if you give them the US dollars, they'll buy something for you, so you can say, oh yes, I really want like, I'm really trying to like get a new phone, and they'll say like, okay, if you like, yeah, an iPhone is like, I think $800, $1,000, and if you have the money, I'll like get you one, because because they might be getting one themselves or whatever, and it's still like a lot of money, but it's still way way cheaper than here. I haven't looked at phone prices in like a really long time, so I have no clue how much they were.
Well, let's actually talk about the current day then. Now that we're talking about like modern technology, what is your assessment of the current Argentinian economy? You know, what is it good at, if anything? What is it bad at, and are there specific reforms that need to be made? I guess this is a really big question, like describe the whole economy.
Massive.
So, but I guess what I would say is, if you were in charge of the country's economy, what would you think are the biggest issues, and what would you do about them?
Well, I mean, I think there's like three big families of issues, and they're all interrelated in really like hard to untangle ways. But there's basically like your bread and butter macroeconomic issues like inflation and basically just inflation, right? So inflation, so like prices go up 50% a year. They went up 51% last year, and this year is predicted to be much worse. People are saying like the latest forecast by like the central bank survey were like 76%. So we're talking about like
I just want everyone who complains about inflation in America to just take a second. And I want Maia to repeat that for us. Say it one more time.
Like the and this is an optimistic forecast. They're always like running behind the data. The June forecast for inflation was 76% for this year, so for 2022. So like I mean, July, most people say it's going to be like really high. It's going to be like 7%, 8%, maybe 9%. So yeah, like the US has the highest inflation in 40 years, and we have like that in like a month and a half. But yeah, so you have like this so you have like the macroeconomic issue of inflation, and that obviously like chips away at people's income, and like so you have higher poverty and lower real wages, and like it makes like investing really risky, because like inflation is is accelerating, and it's like really unstable. So like I'm going to talk about like inflation in particular later, because I'm pretty sure it's going to come up. So and then you have like a lot of microeconomic issues, so like a lot of taxes and laws and regulations that like really harm specific markets, so you and also contribute to inflation, right? So you have like this like really distortionary fiscal and trade protection regime for like a handful of sectors, most notably textiles and electronics, and they're like really unproductive and like really much more expensive than like what you see in comparable countries, right? So you have like that sort of thing, and you have like rent control laws that made rent like skyrocket and be a much how share of the average wage. So you see, I actually was looking at like how high rent was in like 2019 in a newspaper article, and it was like about a quarter to a third of income in like the middle class neighborhoods, right? If you live in Puerto Madero, which is like where all the rich, the celebrities and the politicians live, obviously you're going to be paying like $1,000 a month, which is a lot of money. But like, yeah, in a normal neighborhood, it was like 30% of income, a third, maybe 40% if you were like in a nicer place. But like, if you go now, it's like, oh yeah, you like the average wage is 140,000 pesos, and you say like, oh yeah, you can like find rental underneath 50. Number three is like fundamentally the country has also major issues with economic growth. So like the economy has not grown at all since 2011 or 2012. So like you see, it's not like it's grown 0%. There's just having like a bunch of recessions. So the economy fell 2% and grew 2% and fell 2% and grew 2% and then it fell. So it didn't grow. It only grew on like all the numbered years which are also election years. So like 2011, 2013, 2015, 2017. And then 2018 and 2019 you had a recession, and 2020 obviously another recession. And now 2021 some growth. This year it could go either way. Like there could be a recession or there could be like 1% growth.
It seems like a pretty serious situation where you're saying
Oh yeah,
inflation is
it's really
chronically
bad.
high, growth is chronically very low, and there's a bunch of really bad microeconomic rules. So if you presented kind of three problems there, if you could have like your top three policies to help fix the economy, what would you focus on?
Well, regarding inflation, the really big problem is that you have a fiscal policy that's like incredibly unbalanced, and so you have a really high deficit, and like it's just funded by printing money. So you have to like reform. You have to do like a fiscal reform.
Maya, it sounds like you haven't read about MMT yet. The magical money theory, right?
Oh no, no! Like, the worst case scenario here is that like a person that believes in MMT like gets taken in by by this government, like two economist ministers from now. You go to get like someone who's really crazy, and like you have this massive expansion of spending funded by like printing money in an election year, and then you like the country just burns to the ground the next year. The next year, but
right,
like
so
yeah,
I distracted you though. I distracted you.
yeah,
So
yeah. No.
number one was just reform the fiscal spending, basically.
Reform, like you need like lower spending, and there's like two sources of the deficit that like are major issues. The first is electricity subsidies and like heating subsidies and transportation subsidies and water subsidies. But like there's like a really like in 2015 it was users paid like to 10% of the cost of providing services. So the government had to foot the entirety of the bill, and back in 2015 it explained 3/4 of the deficit. And the other issue, which is going to like get progressively worse, is social security. So like they really expanded who could get social security benefits, which I mean it's not like unarguably, it's not like universally bad. Like I think that giving money to all people is like an interesting idea, at least in terms of welfare. So it went for like 2/3 of the elderly having a retirement to like 93%, and that made them like the least poor group in society. And I also think that we should expand welfare spending, because it's not like that big an expense. It's like a couple of points of GDP. Well, a couple is a lot, but like one more point, it's like 1 point of GDP right now, and it will be like another one, and you have like a pretty, not generous, but like a pretty respectable welfare state for a developing country. And like you target it mostly to like poor children, and because like 2/3 of children in the country were poor by the end of 2021. So that's like a really serious issue, and it's related to inflation because like food costs are really high and housing costs are really high, and stuff like clothing is really expensive. And it's also related to like the country not growing because like you have a really weak labor market, and you have a labor market that's primarily like employment growth is primarily like the public sector hiring more people to like not do anything productive but like keep them off unemployment.
Yeah,
And
it's like the one thing you got to remember when you're doing all this spending is that like social spending is a good thing in and of itself. It's good to help people, but on some level you've got to be able to pay for it macroeconomically. If your country is not growing, but you want to like provide a more robust safety net, ultimately you've got to pay for it, right? And so in a country with no growth, with no growth, it's a problem.
And it's a problem because like the country has like it has like a high corporate tax, and it's a bad tax, but like it's a normal one. But it has like a shockingly bad income tax system. So like it really disincentivizes being in the private sector, because like if you're collecting welfare and you get a job, you stop collecting it, and you also have to start paying income tax like at really low levels because they never updated for inflation. And right now it's really bizarre because they decided to like give poor people more money, and also like massively cut income tax for seemingly no reason. So I have no clue how they're squaring that. But you also have like a lot of really distortionary and bad taxes. You have export taxes, and that like tax basically you get a tenth to a third less money if you sell something abroad, and if you're like and that's on top of like the official exchange rate being really low, so the market exchange rate.
That's so interesting, because like most countries would kill to have a lot of exports. Like there's a lot of nationalists who are very angry when you import something, because like imports, oh, you steal jobs, but you send our jobs away to somewhere else. But most countries are very happy to export. Like when I think about Japan, Korea, Taiwan, all those countries that became rich, they did it by exporting to the rest of the world. So
like the core tenet of mercantilism is like you have to export as much as you can and import as little as you have.
Yeah, and I don't agree with mercantilism, but
no, but
I understand it. I don't even understand why you would be mad at exports.
Basically, like the thought process there is that like exports are primarily agricultural, so like, and the thought process is that they're just like selling away like soybeans and corn and like huge pots of milk that like have no labor in them. So like they say like, oh, the amounts exported are like basically always the same because there's only so much land in the country, and like so you can tax away the higher profits from if prices are high. Obviously, when prices are low, they don't cut export taxes anyway. So who'd be able to say? But like the problem there is that there's a huge like about a third of exports are like agricultural manufacturers, and about like 20% are industrial manufacturers, so like chemicals and that sort of thing. And like primary products are overwhelmingly just like random. I'm going to like drop that. And and agricultural manufacturers employ a lot of people, so like about a third of industrial employment is just like people who work in like the food sector, and if you add in like other export heavy sectors, it starts getting like to a majority almost. And so like if you start like making exporting things that employ a lot of people very unprofitable, then like you are going to end up like harming the economy. So that's like the thought process for why like they're so unfavorable to exports. And if you're like a service professional, so if like I start doing like freelance work for abroad, it's even worse, because like there you don't pay as many taxes, but you do have to like contend with the exchange rate, which like in the parallel market it's about like 300 pesos per dollar. So like you come to Argentina, you go to like the nicest restaurants in town, you pay like 5,000 pesos per person, like the most extravagant meal you can think of, and that's like about $20. And like, but if at the official rate it's like 150, 180 in that range. So you end up like making like half of what you'll make on top of the and then you have to pay taxes on like the money. So one time I like did a small, I don't know, I don't even remember what, and it was like $200, which is a pretty nice sum. At that time it was like a month pay, and like I had to pay taxes on it, which I was like not too upset about because like such is life. But I got it at the official exchange rate, so I ended up getting like out of 200, I ended up getting 80. So obviously that really incentivizes like evading taxes when you export, and like when you export like a cow, obviously you're not going to be able to export to evade a lot of taxes because
There's another problem where, if the tax system is too unfair or is seen as bizarre, then people will just try to ignore it. They'll try to cheat and they'll try to evade the taxes, and I'm sure that happens to some extent too.
Yeah, like I was going to like try to circle back to taxes, so that's I will segue into that. So like taxes are really really distortionist. So like they really the idea of taxes is that like you don't like punish people for working more, you don't punish people for like trying to start a business or anything. So you say they're distortionist when they like change the incentives of behavior, and like it's usually in a bad way, right? So like you work fewer hours, or you like and like labor laws and especially labor regulations are really stringent. Like hiring you formally is really really expensive, and that's like designed so the government doesn't have to like pay you unemployment insurance ever.
So we've only got a little bit of time left here, but I want to circle back to some of the social media stuff. As far as we've been talking a lot about Argentina, but one of the interesting things is that a couple times now, when we started the neoliberal shill contest, it was won by like very famous commentators, Matt Iglesias and Noah Smith, and Scott Lincecum. And the last two contests have been won by people who are more like social media famous, I guess. Bastiat is best known as a Twitter personality and a Twitch streamer. And you are best known for your writing on economics and your kind of Twitter personality. And it almost makes me think, like, how are we communicating ideas in the modern world? Like, our ideas about politics and our ideas about economics. Do you think that, like, all of this stuff that we're doing on social media, does it actually matter in the end? Like, is this actually kind of an important part of our political and economic discourse?
Well, I mean, regardless of whether you think it should or shouldn't matter, it's very clear that it does. Like, things that you say online do end up like if you have enough of a reach, or if you like say something that enough people see, it does end up like reaching influential people in good ways or bad ways, right? So there's like this account that posts like random liberals it doesn't like, and it ends up with like mobs of like armed people harassing local libraries for hosting drag queens, or like Ron DeSantis' press secretary talking about like liberal pedophilia, basically. So like that's the sort of thing that. So it's very clear that like it actually does matter, and it actually does have an impact.
And you think some of those ideas like originated on social media?
Yeah. Like you like post your way into people like knowing what you're talking about, and then like it starts spraying on its own, right? So like you post about like, oh yeah, the Federal Reserve should target nominal GDP, and you talk about it online, and it's actually an idea with like a lot of intellectual clout, and that a lot of like really important people discuss, and it was like they ended up popularizing it for their blogs. And so like you end up reaching a lot of people on a really, I'm not gonna say niche, but on like a really niche idea, and it's just like originated online, and now there's like like the Federal Reserve discussed nominal GDP targeting in 2014 or 15, and they basically said, "Oh yeah, it's a good idea, but like I don't know if people will understand it." And it's like a really big topic of discussion now among like experts and like policy advisors to the government and everything. So it does actually matter, even if like only a few people read what you say. Like you don't need, like if you have like 500,000 followers or 1 million followers, or like you have one of these massive YouTube channels, obviously like you're going to reach a lot of people, and that's where your influence comes from. But if you have like 3,000 followers or 500 followers, you're still going to like reach someone who reaches someone who like works at a think tank, or like advises this or that organization, or like advises the government in this or that area, and it might like actually change their mind. It might actually like influence policy, or like influence like the way people think about the issues.
So we've come up on time now, so I will ask you the traditional final question that we always ask on this podcast, which is, where should people go to learn more? And I will give a couple of suggestions to begin with. First, they should go follow at Maia Mindel on Twitter, and then they should go check out Some Unpleasant on Substack. But other than your own writing, is there anything in particular that you would recommend for people who want to understand Argentina or Latin American politics, or just any of the things that we've talked about today?
Well, understanding Argentina is really hard. I don't think that most people whose work is understanding Argentina understand the country. So, I mean, there's this quote that says, like, no people in the world like monetary experiments more than people from Argentina. They change currencies as often as they change presidents. And it's from 1899. So, like, from the 19th century. And people were saying, like, oh, the country's monetary policy is a mess. But, so it's really hard to learn about Argentina, and it's really hard to learn about it credibly. So, I mean, just like, I would recommend that you just look for like actual Argentinians and people who have experience living here, and people who like study the country and its history, either for like either academically or for the media, and follow them, because they're often, even if not right, they're often like insightful about a variety of things that you normally don't get exposed to.
Well, it's good advice, and I certainly hope that people will take it. It's coming from 2022's chief neoliberal shill, Maia Mindel. Maia, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.